We adopt the agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We will proceed accordingly. Next on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of the July 11th, 2017 Planning Commission meeting. Anybody have any corrections or additions?
None.
You guys are good down there?
We're good.
Oh, you
I
were
was-
there. That's right.
Neither one of us were
All
there,
right. We'll leave you out of this part.
You guys covered everything. Well, the one I do miss seemed to be quite short, so.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and move to approve the minutes of the July 11th, 2017 Planning Commission. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Moving on to new business, we have two items tonight. The first one on the agenda is the building materials and site plan review for Lions Shelter.
Thank you. So like Commissioner Loshin said, tonight we are reviewing the building material and site plan for the Lion Shelter. Al Orson is in the audience tonight. He has a really nice overview of what the shelter is going to look like. He's part of the Lions Club, has some of the details that we're probably looking for. As part of the review process, we did hold a neighborhood meeting tonight at 5:30. The city council thought it would be a good idea, since it's going to be a renovation of a project that's in a residential area, to hold that neighborhood meeting. So we had 6 residents that came. They had some really good dialogue with Al, asked some good questions that we can recap once Al goes through his presentation. So just a quick look. I take it many of you know where Lions Park is, but the left is a bit farther out, and then right is where the renovation is actually going to take place. So it's the existing structure. Al has some really good visuals of what it looks like today and what it will look like after the renovation. The overall footprint is not changing, so that's something important to remember. And then the next slide, I just have the resolution once we get to that point. Otherwise, I'll welcome Al up if you want to begin your presentation.
Can I say one thing real quick? Due to my outside interest, being a Lion member for quite a while and also part of the neighborhood, I'm going to recuse myself from the vote, but will participate if needed in the discussion.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. Just for a little bit of background, I am a resident of Victoria. Moved in 1972, so we've seen lots of changes, and lots more changes coming. I spent my previous career, I'm retired now, first 16 years for City of Wayzata as the city engineer, and then the last 20 years as the Wayzata city manager, so familiar with city government. With that, I'll jump in. This is a replica of what the structure looks like today, and please interrupt me and ask any questions that you would have along the way. This is a 3-dimensional model, so I can move it around if you're looking for different views. When we take that down, we will be removing, actually originally I had planned to try to save some of the concrete that's shown in white out here, but decided later that that would look like a patch quilt. So actually the white plus the yellow will be removed, as well as the roof. Once the roof is off of the existing open air shelter, one of the very first things that we will be doing will be installing a new water main from the hydrant that's on the northeast corner of Petunia and 82nd Street, directionally bored under the street, under the utilities that are in the street, under the parking lot, the storm sewer that's in the parking lot, and into the breezeway. This mouse doesn't show up very good. Down at this point, it'll actually be coming into that breezeway and be on the east wall of the Lion's Den, where there will be a cabinet around the fire sprinkler equipment. Once you start remodeling a building, we are, by code, have to fire sprinkler the Lion's Den, the kitchen, concession, bathroom area, plus the new facility. So it became quite an expensive part of the whole deal. It's like a $75,000 deal to put the water main in and fire sprinkler the entire structure. After demolition, it will look something like this. We'll be taking everything down, and as I mentioned, it's showing that this stays, but this is actually going to go also to the face of the it's at the west face of the concession building, where there are currently 4 serving windows, but for structural reasons, on the next slide I'll show that we have to fill that in. I'm going to switch over to we will be filling in that serving window and putting in a bond beam across that. Currently, this westerly wall was not a structural wall. The rafters were running the opposite direction. Under the new building, that'll become the bearing wall for the trusses. So after getting the water main in, the next thing that will be tackled is, because we were unable to do soil borings on that wall and find out what the footing strength was, we're putting in 5 helical piers under that wall to make sure that there's adequate strength to carry the new trusses and the roof load of the new significantly larger roof area. From there, we will be tackling the foundation. We're putting in foundation pads for the 4 doors. There'll be a walk door to the breezeway. That breezeway will be closed off, and a walk door over at this point. And we're staying on the 10-foot sidewalk that's there today, a new wall and a walk door out. And without the foundation under the pad that leads up to the door, you're susceptible to having that freeze and not being able to get the doors to work in the winter. So this will make sure that the doors work. Then the framing will go up. Well, I should also, before I flip, mention the tan portion, well, actually the entire portion, the hallway and the tan portion out here will be a heated slab that'll have 5/8 PEX piping, 12 inches on center over the entire area. And there will be a 200,000 BTU boiler located inside the concession building in this corner. So that'll be the primary heat source for the whole area. Then when the framing goes up, it shows that this hallway gets enclosed so that there will be an inside passageway in the winter months, so you don't have to go outside to get to the bathrooms. And the hallway and the breezeway will also have the heated slab. When the roof goes on, we're using a scissor truss arrangement. The existing roof that's out there today is on a 412 pitch. The inside or the bottom of the scissor truss will be a 412 pitch, and the outside, the actual roof material, is on a 612 pitch. And it's not very easy to see, but the trusses have a 2-foot heel higher so that we can get an R50 insulation into that scissor truss area. But that will give a much nicer feeling to the assembly area, having that extra volume up there. And there are 11 garage doors, 6 on the west side, 2 on the south side, 1 on this side, and then 2 over on this side. We originally had planned a door here, but structurally we needed extra shear strength in that wall, and we had to take that door out, but we were allowed to put in a 4x4 window there. So once it's back and opened up, it would be the garage door. The intent is that the garage doors will be open all summer long, put into the upright position and actually locked open so that the kids and people can't be running them up and down at their freedom. The bottom 30 inches is a stone material. This is a sample of the stone material that will be going in the bottom 30 inches. Then above that is, and I failed to mention, the floor. I can flip back there. Besides the heat in the floor, the tan portion of it, the hall will probably be bare concrete, but the assembly area will be putting in a 4-coat epoxy system, choosing that color. Pass that back and forth. And above the stone will be a LP lap siding. It's a engineered wood product, pre-finished with a 20-year guarantee on the finishing material. And then above that, the next darker area is a slightly larger or slightly lighter teak material paneling, and the wood banding is all like an AZAC trim material. It's a synthetic, not a wood product. So all the trim is, so everything will be in, and then in the very peak, it's got kind of a scallop shingle that will be the ivory color, and all the trim white. And actually the garage doors will also be the match the ivory. So with the doors closed in the winter, the doors on the upper panel will have windows in them. So there will be a fair amount of daylight into the area. And it's this model is superimposed on a aerial photo from Google Earth. This one I put in 4 trees, the 4 trees that are closest to the building area, so you have a sense for where they're at, but the trees will not be touched. So there's no loss of trees. Square footage of hard surface is the same as out there today, so there's no increased runoff. Inside, the bottom 7 feet has a 1/2-inch plywood sheeting around it, and then is covered with a glass board product called FRP, fiber reinforced plastic. It's often used in bathrooms. It's washable, durable, often used in kitchens. And the ceiling in the area will be tongue and groove knotty pine. And this is a sample of the shingles. And the entire roof of the existing den, concession, everything will be re-roofed. Above the FRP that goes right to the top of the trim line around the garage doors, above that is a product by the name of Tectum, which is 1.25 inch sound panels that are put on to reduce the sound because the hard surfaces to try to control the sound level. I think that pretty much finishes the remarks I have. Any questions? Want to go back or expound on anything else? The primary concern of the neighbors, and had previously talked to Aaron a little bit about it, of possibly, well, I should back up and say that you can fit 32 tables of 8 in that space. So you could get up to 250 people and still have reasonable aisles to walk around it. 250 people, if you figured 1.75 cars for the crowd, or maybe even closer, 2 to 1, often couples coming in one vehicle, that you would have somewhere between 125 to 140 cars. There's 40 spaces in the paved parking lot, and there's room for 120 cars in the gravel parking further south. So one idea might be to post no parking on one side of the street. At the softball tournament, when you get people parking on both sides, it's hardly traffic to get emergency vehicles in and out, etc. Or maybe you want to ban parking during events on street, ban on-street parking, especially on 82nd Street and maybe Petunia. And the neighbors were warm to that idea. I think that wraps up my comments.
Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions or?
I have a couple questions. I think I heard you say this, but I think you're wrapping the whole structure in the new product, the new siding, the new roofing, so it'll all match and look wonderful.
Yes.
It's a great looking project, by the way.
Thank you.
Then question for the city. I know we've been maintaining it and we own the existing structure. What is the increased cost going to be as far as maintenance with the additional heating and those types of things we'll be adding to the city budget? And has that been accounted for?
I haven't really tried to estimate that.
Right. Part of the discussion so far is not focused on operational costs. I mean, certainly the structure is getting improved. There are things that are being heated that today aren't being heated, so there's some level of increase of cost, but we'd probably view that as somewhat nominal, given that it's more in-floor heat. But some of those things will get worked through once the project gets under construction. We kind of finalize what those different systems are that actually get put into the structure beyond just kind of the aesthetic remodel work that Al's outlined.
I did not mention that the primary walk door would be on the two of them, one on the northeast corner and one on the southwest corner. And above each of those walk doors, we have planned to put in air curtains to keep the heat in and keep the cold out.
Other than, excuse me, other than parking, were there any other concerns raised at the neighborhood meeting?
No, I did not mention we're also planning in the winter months to install a gas stove for ambiance and extra heat source.
There was a bit of discussion with the neighborhood meeting about some security. So Al made the point that when the doors are up, they'll be locked, just so then someone couldn't go in there and then shut all the doors. And then Al also mentioned the possibility of having some cameras in the structure at some point in the future, just to...
We're intending to get internet into the building so that we would have the option to add sophisticated locking and cameras and security.
I often bike by the facility now to cut over to downtown. I live over by Holy Family, cut over, and they're cycling through that area is always a challenge because there's not really a good sidewalk on the side. Currently, you have to kind of weave your way through or walk your bike through. If no one's there, you weave your way through. Sometimes my kids weave their way through regardless, and I talk to them about that. Is there I think I saw a sidewalk on what would be the west side of the building. Is the intention to be that accessible when the doors are closed so you can still cycle past the facility?
Yep.
Okay. I think you said the doors will be open in the summer, so when most people are cycling.
Yeah, the intent would be that they would be opened up in the spring when the weather permits and locked open so that they can't get closed. And then in the winter, shut and locked shut.
You can then cycle around or use the sidewalk around the west side.
Yeah.
Okay. It was very helpful to have the model. Thank you for bringing that.
Actually, if I flip back. There is sidewalk along this side. On the other side,
And
it's really tight in here.
what's just in general the width between the building and the edge of the sidewalk on the west side of the building? Can you measure
4 feet.
4 feet, okay. Thank you.
So, Al, one thing, I don't even think you and me have discussed this, but the bathrooms, do we have those up to a current handicap standard, which,
I did
Would
go
be part
through
of the
that with
process.
Tom Gray, and he said that for the occupant load coming in, that there are the correct number of fixtures.
yeah, fixture-wise, I can see, but heights of some stuff isn't, some of the partitions and just observing what I observed this weekend as I walked through, some of the stuff isn't what you'd call handicap accessible as far as latches, handles, door clearance. A few things that'll have to be tweaked, I believe, could add a few dollars, but nothing, we don't have to redo the bathrooms.
Not major, no.
Yep. That's something I really think we have to be careful of too, is whenever we upgrade something, we have to make it fully accessible in
Yep.
all contexts.
Yeah, is there a natural next steps of the process? Just a couple questions around that. So, a code review. Sounds like you've been consulting a bit. Is there a natural
Prior
build in
to
the process?
Tom leaving, I had several meetings with him.
Okay.
So like most projects that go through site plan building materials, this is really kind of an informed plan that you're reviewing, but it hasn't been fully vetted to where they're pulling a permit tomorrow. But I believe the Lions have said once they get through the approvals, their goal would be to pull a permit and start construction maybe sometime in August or September, depending on what schedules look like for how the shelter has been reserved to date.
Breaking it into 2 pieces, if we start this August, we would do the demolition, get the water line in, then the helical piers, then the foundation and the floor, and then shut down for the remainder of the winter, and then in the spring, start up with framing and
Yeah. My thought with regard to code review is I would encourage that sooner rather than later, just because as I'm seeing the project develop, it's kind of a unique animal in that we're in some ways adapting its use. You know, we're sort of making it more of an internal assembly type space, which has, you know, a different set of provisions, and it's also unique in its seasonal nature. You know, in terms of the various codes that apply with all the requirements for insulation and heating and cooling and those types of things. And then the food service, it adds a whole nother layer of complexity in terms of making sure that it gets a food
this
service
point-
code review.
we're not touching the kitchen.
Okay.
That'll be a future phase.
So right now, it is not a licensed food service facility.
Sure.
So that would be a huge upgrade that would happen
Down the
Yeah.
road.
hopefully in the future.
But it could be a good conversation to have sooner rather than later to understand if there are additional requirements beyond what's there today. Then you might have a good opportunity to integrate it in the plan now with the addition. And there may not be, but I'm just, you know, thinking that
There is, though, you're on the right track. I
Yeah.
mean, we've discussed this, and it's just not cost feasible, but it could be something in there that would be required by the city for us to add upon the plan review by the building official. You might
Right.
say, well, I've looked at this, and we have to adjust this minimally to make it cohesive for the space itself.
yeah, and understanding the circumstances of the project, you'd like it to be as streamlined and successful as possible. So conversations earlier would be good. And then I had a similar question about the boring strategy. I'm confident at some point that'll go for engineering review. But has there been a preliminary review? That seems to be in the context of the site plan review.
There has not been any review of the soils underneath the building to date. We haven't done any borings or anything. I think that's why the proposal to date includes doing the helical, just assuming that there needs to be something, but I'm assuming once we get into excavating the existing slab
Maybe.
and see the soils, something different may come up.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I misspoke a little bit. So the boring, I'm thinking, is the underground boring of the
Directional
infrastructure,
boring.
the directional bore underneath the roadway and the.
I've met with Kara and walked her through
Sure.
everything.
Okay. Good.
She made sure that, that we were
Yes,
in
and
compliance.
one of the contractors that we've regularly worked with has been out to evaluate the route that's been looked at to verify that it could be done and that everything generally jives with what the proposal includes.
Okay. If you don't mind, if I just keep going with a couple of extra questions. So, event parking, is that something that the city, I assume, has managed in the past and may seem like it's not necessarily, well, I think the staff report concludes that parking is adequate, but I think when we evaluate a real-world event, it sounds like there could be some spillover. And so is the city a partner in that process in terms of making those provisions?
So how this project has been evaluated and discussed relative to parking is that we're really not changing the area that's occupied or conducive for events, either in the park or the shelter itself. And I know the staff report concludes that parking is adequate, and I think what is intended to be conveyed is we do have on-site parking available within the park itself. We also have on-street parking available adjacent to the park, and that's what's been used for things like the Lions softball tournament and other larger event parking because it's allowed. Certainly a lot of conversations been had by council at various points, 2 different councils in the case of this project that have at least been aware of this potential proposal coming forward, that I think until this facility gets changed in the way that's being presented, we don't necessarily know if demand changes, other than there's more flexibility for year-round use, where you might have more larger events throughout the year instead of just seasonally like we've experienced to date. But yes, the city would certainly be a partner in continuing to monitor what are the needs. I know the neighbors that were here at the neighborhood meeting had volunteered some suggestions for how to accommodate additional parking and maybe not being so cumbersome on the adjoining residential sites, with whether it's looking at on-street parking additions, whether it's diagonal, more of programmed on-street instead of kind of the informal, just park along the side of the street because there's room kind of thing. All those things have been discussed throughout the course of this project's evolution, and I think will continue to get evaluated once we know exactly if anything changes much other than just the seasonal use.
I did not mention the Lions are involved in the construction, et cetera, but the intent is the mission of the Lions is we lost our home when the former City Hall assembly area was taken down and not rebuilt, that this would become the Lions' home and that we wouldn't have to pay to rent it, but give it back to the city after it's completed, and the city would manage and rent out the facility. And I think there will be enough demand that it'll probably become a moneymaker for the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really respect the partnership, so appreciate that background. So I think that's good background, Ben, because it makes me feel like the parking requirements, if there's a clear path for the city to manage it in the event type situations, and it sounds like there's actually several options to deal with that, then it's actually not, then I think it's true the parking requirements are met, and it's just good feedback to monitor going forward. Last question I had was, so our focus tonight is really mostly about the building materials and the site plan review. The background of the project was really great because I think it helps enable a good discussion around that. Mm-hmm. So from a building material standpoint, do you have access to the requirements that you could pull up on the screen?
We don't necessarily have specific requirements for city park facilities, so this isn't necessarily falling into a standard form, but I think what the Lions have put together is really trying to be respectful of the fact that this structure, due to its location and proximity, is more residential in character, so they're really trying to be more cognizant of matching kind of the residential nature around it. But generally speaking, the city doesn't have architectural material requirements for any of its parks.
Okay, so
As a whole.
we're not holding this to that type of a standard in terms of its
Correct.
durable materials and percentages and.
Correct. The point of going through this process and having more of a formal review by the Planning Commission and also the City Council isn't so much to say we have to do this. It was more a desire from the council to make sure, because this is a focal point in one of the larger parks we have, that they wanted to make sure that there was equal opportunity for residents to be informed early before anything would just be decided, to gain any feedback about what kind of impacts they may see this project having, and then to have more of a formal review then by the Planning Commission and City Council, formally reviewing it like we would a private development, basically holding ourselves to a typical metric in terms of how we dialogue with surrounding neighbors with these types of improvements. So a little bit different in that a standard park, when we're just talking about like playground equipment, that goes through a neighborhood meeting process, and then it gets reviewed by the Park and Rec Commission, or Park and Rec Committee, excuse me. They've already reviewed this concept and have kind of reviewed this, but because we're dealing with a larger structure, it seemed appropriate, because this group, if it was a private development, we would review that private structure, that it would come here and then to City Council through that process.
Yeah, and there are some requirements associated with, like, park buildings that are constructed by the city, right? Or am I not remembering that correctly?
We don't have any formal architectural requirements for park facilities of any
Okay.
type.
Well, I think that's okay. I wanted to clarify that, and I mean, in terms of being clear about the standard in which we're evaluating it. But I think the part of the discussion that I do appreciate is sort of understanding the background that you shared and the partnership with the city, is that, you know, this becomes a city-owned and city-maintained structure in many ways. And so I actually appreciate the attention to detail in terms of materials that are durable and, you know, 20-year warranty and, you know, sort of standing the test of time. From a city building standpoint, I think that makes a lot of good sense.
Okay.
That's all I had. Sorry, I kind
Thank you.
of took the floor there for a moment. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Or?
My questions were all related to the neighborhood, the parking, and the rental and availability, which have all been discussed. Other than that, I think it's a good-looking project, and I think it was very well presented, so thank you.
Thank you.
I have one quick one. Is there going to be any impact on the baseball field that's behind it at all? I mean, I know you're staying within the footprint on the concrete that's already there, but looking at this, that bleacher that's behind there, it looks like it might be impacted. I don't know, it might not be to scale or not, but is there going to be any impact on the field to the south or no?
To this.
As far as proximity to the building.
Right,
That's really
exactly.
not changing.
No.
It's not,
It
none?
isn't, right?
Actually, I should stand corrected. This is showing from this point on an additional 4-foot sidewalk. Only because there's a door down there, that would be actually technical hard surface increase.
Yep.
So it's about 45 feet by 4 feet wide.
But no
Currently,
impact to
from
the
this point, everything
bleachers.
back here is currently hard surface.
But to answer your question, no impact on existing bleachers, benches, fencing, backstop.
Okay.
Right.
And just to confirm, this facility would be available to other organizations for use or rent, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I fully anticipate, because there's an additional 7-month period where it would be usable, that there would be anniversary parties, smaller weddings. And initially, you can use the kitchen in the summer. In the winter, it's a catering kitchen. No food preparation on site. And the primary, today, well, like at the softball tournament, there were burgers and brats and pork burgers being cooked under the hood. And the hood, exhausting, there's plenty of makeup air. It's all open air. Well, now being enclosed and the doors closed in the winter, you will not be able to use that hood until the kitchen is upgraded, because the big cost driving kitchen upgrades is now you have to have enough makeup air that you're taking outside 10 below weather, getting it up to 70 degrees to push into the kitchen. That's a big deal.
Is there a pretty simple way to lock down those appliances in the wintertime so guests renting the unit wouldn't have access to them or wouldn't be able to turn them on?
Yeah, we have control valves on the gas lines that are isolated that we can shut off, so.
Okay.
Just to piggyback on your kitchen feature enhancement, does it make business sense while you're tearing everything up to bring in proper utility to allow for that to happen?
Yes, we're upgrading the electrical from a 200 amp service to a 400 amp service.
Excellent. Thank you.
Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much for all the background and the discussion. I think hearing all that, I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve resolution number 17-12, which is a resolution recommending approval of a site plan and building materials for a renovation to Lions Park Shelter for property located at 1505 82nd Street, with the conditions as noted in the staff report. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none. And Todd, you did not vote.
One abstention. Yeah.
Sounds that way.
Can't say that word.
Spelled too.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
All right, so we'll move on to the next item tonight, which is a building materials and site plan review for Mount Olivet Church.
Thank you. As noted, proposal tonight relates to Mount Olivet's site. We're running out of seniority on the commission that probably would have seen a similar proposal in 2014. But as noted in the staff report, this is a very similar proposal that's been in the works to expand the existing church facility on the Mount Olivet campus that currently has, I would say, two primary uses, both kind of their church facility, including the administrative building on the north portion of the site, and then Mount Olivet Rolling Acres, which is more of a residential facility on the southern portion of the site. Tonight, focusing on the northern half, so to speak, of that project, with an addition about 69,000 square feet in 3 different floors that are being added as part of that addition space. The increased aerial on the right, the area in purple, showing the footprint of where that addition resides relative to the existing church structure to the north of it. You can also see some darker gray areas where some parking improvements as well as some other access improvements are being made. One of the principal differences between what is being requested tonight and under consideration from what had been presented in 2014 really relates to the architectural design of the facility. So a lot of the uses within this proposed addition very similar, but just the general design of this space not exceeding the overall height requirement of the district, which had been the case in 2014. So a conditional use permit had been requested and granted in 2014. Because no work on the request had been moved forward within a year's time, that conditional use permit has expired. And as the church and kind of their partners have re-looked at what the addition would mean, the design that's being requested tonight doesn't exceed the 35-foot height requirement for the building facility itself. They've also taken a much closer look at logistics of getting into and out of the site. So where most of the improvements proposed in 2014 had kind of a continuation of how the site functions today in terms of being able to drive into the north portion of the facility and still get to the south, or vice versa. This proposal really provides better functionality for people visiting for services or church functions specifically, where they're really utilizing the north 2 of the 3 total accesses into the site. So grade is being brought up on the southern or existing parking lot to try to keep it more consistent from north to south for where people would be parking to utilize the church facility. So there will be a break then between the north half of the site and the south half of the site. So the residential portion utilizing just the southernmost entrance from Rolling Acres. That entrance would also serve as the access to an existing lift station that's kind of southwest of the addition footprint. Would also serve as a location or route for service deliveries for anything that the church functionally needs in terms of having, trash removal and any other kinds of large vehicles getting into the backside of the church addition. Just talk through briefly, just so that we've hit on it. This is the site as it exists today. You can see the 2 northernmost accesses, one in alignment with interlocking, this serving as their primary access into the site. And then the on your site plan, it would have been called the south access. It's actually the middle access into the property. These would be the 2 primary access points that are maintained just for the church property. In addition to the church facility that's here where my cursor is, there's an administrative building that would get removed as part of these improvements, replaced with a north parking lot, so expanding parking availability within the campus itself. And then just to hit on it while I have the aerial pulled up, a lot of the west area of the existing parking lot ends up getting reworked to try to match grade better and provide a better transition into and out of the site from Rolling Acres Road. So then looking at the proposed conditions, obviously as I noted, the northern parking lot would be new. Purple area, again, identifying just that building footprint of the addition. And then you can see the reworked or revamped southern parking space for the church itself. Because it's superimposed over the aerial, you still visually see a driveway connection, but that in fact would be removed as part of the improvements here. So all the access around the residential portions of the site would be disconnected from the northern portion of the site. As you may have noticed with the attachments provided, there is a phased approach just so that they don't lose functionality of parking. So the initial phase, removing that administrative building and building the new north parking lot, would be kind of step 1. In addition, the expansion of their existing stormwater management facility on the site to accommodate the additional impervious surface that's being added. And then moving into phase 2, which includes the actual building footprint as well as the southern parking lot reconfiguration and south drive or access from Rolling Acres. Those would all be done separately. Generally speaking, they are increasing the amount of parking provided on site. The city's parking requirements relate to the largest occupancy area. So based upon that requirement with a seating area of 300 people, the minimum parking requirement under the city's ordinance would be 75 parking spaces. they're far exceeding that, as you might imagine if you look through some of the spaces provided within the addition where they have more assembly areas. So they're providing a total of 200 parking spaces. And if you can imagine, the existing parking lot today has roughly 103 spaces in it today. As they're constructing the addition, that new north parking lot would be in place and has roughly the same number of parking stalls in it. So they're continuing the current use, so to speak, of what they have available for parking during construction, and then far surpassing our minimum requirements that are required by ordinance. Elevations were provided as part of the packet information on the north side of this slide, just showing the elevation as it would be viewed from Rolling Acres Road. As you can see, really kind of a story and a half sort of profile or height from Rolling Acres. You can see off to the far right side of the image the pitch that's on the existing portion of the building, just for scale. And then the back side, I think I described it in the staff report somewhat as kind of a walkout house, where you see kind of a single level from the street side, and then it's several floors on the back side that are available just to the topography of the site. All the new mechanical units shown on the back side are screened kind of by a parapet or a part of the elevated roof height from the east facing or street facing elevation. And then they also provided a side elevation just showing what kind of the end of that building is. The large gray area here just showing kind of the backdrop of that pitched roof that exists on the current church building today. The applicant did not provide specific building materials, simply because they're matching all of the existing materials that are on the existing structure. When it's completed, this should look like it was generally all built at once, so trying to match same as same with all the material that's on the existing structure. So stone accents, some different aluminum cladding systems that are currently on the church today. But again, just trying to make it look like a holistic facility from start to finish. Floor plans were also included in your information. This showing kind of the main level, or when you enter from the street side into the facility, the different spaces, including a large assembly or sanctuary space, and then a lot of classroom or educational practice areas for things like choirs and other groups on that main level. Lower level having more of kind of a kitchen. I know Al Orson, and at the previous agenda item, it talked about the Lions moving to a similar type of space at St. Victoria's Church. So similar gathering space on this first lower level of the two lower levels that are proposed, additional classroom spaces and restrooms. And then the lowest level that would be kind of that walkout level, providing additional classroom space and really taking up about half of the total footprint of the overall addition at that level. So it'll also be the spot that kind of that loading dock function, or that area where whether it was fire trucks or delivery trucks could back up to the rear portion and have access to the building from that standpoint. Do have conditions provided as part of the resolution. Happy to go through those. Similar to the Lions Park project, because we're just reviewing site plan and building materials, there was not a requirement for neighborhood notification. However, we have had quite a bit of dialogue with residents around Schutz Lake. So I did send out an email informing of the meeting tonight. Haven't had a ton of reaction to this project. Did have one adjoining neighbor that had been fairly involved with the project in 2014 that abuts the site, and just wanted to ensure that similar improvements or accommodations that had been proposed in 2014 in terms of getting a fence line rebuilt and making sure that some of the screening on that north side of the site was still going to be in place as part of this revised edition. That was some of the dialogue that took place. I know that Tom McNally, the pastor at the campus here, did follow up and reassure that individual that those accommodations, whether they were required or not from the city, would be accommodated as part of this proposal. We do have representation for the church in terms of their consultants, both the project architect and civil engineer are here if you have questions about the site or the building itself. Otherwise, I'd hand it over to the commission for any questions you may have.
Ben, I am that neighbor that you were referring to. Can I say a couple things? Is that all right?
It's totally up to the commission. It's not necessarily a public hearing, but if you'd like to take comment, you're welcome.
Sure. We welcome your feedback. We'll factor that in the discussion. If you could if you could step up, state your name and address, and share some thoughts with us.
I'm Chris Lovering from 7100 Rolling Acres Road, so we're the property immediately north of the church at the property line there. I have to say, like any of us in this room in 2014 when this started, I wasn't excited that a residential building that's adjacent to my property is going to be turned into a 97-spot parking lot. But we did go through a long process with the church and with the city, and as part of the conditional use permit, they agreed that they would replace the existing chain link fence with a 6-foot opaque fence in that process. So when I learned that we're going through this process again, I was disappointed to see that that wasn't included in the plans that the church had submitted, because we had it in the conditional use permit before. It was agreed to by the city, by Tom McNally from the church. So I was disappointed, worked with Ben. I talked with Tom, and he committed to that in an email to me. But we all know how big projects work and how things get lost or players change. And so that's my concern as a resident, and the commitment around that happening without it being documented anywhere. So that's the concern I have. The church is a great neighbor. We're supportive of this process. We think it's important. They're an important part of the community. So that's one thing. One other thing that I want to bring up is something I noticed tonight when I was reviewing this little picture, because my understanding of parking lots is that they can't be within 50 feet of a property line. And when I looked at the parking lot on here, I know the width of my property is 87 feet. And so half of that's 43 feet, and that is not between the property line and the edge of the parking lot. That's less than 43 feet. That looks closer to 35 feet in just looking at a little picture that I have here. So that's my concern, because I understood the city code to be those 50 feet of the property line.
I don't believe that that's accurate.
I have Article 9, Section 109, 294, parking lots. Parking lots providing parking for more than 10 vehicles shall not be included within 50 feet of the lot line. So those are my concerns as a neighboring property owner. A 97-spot parking lot, lights, noise, disruption. The fence is really important to us, and making sure that the distance of the parking lot is appropriate for the city code. Thanks.
Great. Thank
Chris,
you.
I had a quick question for you, if you don't mind. What kind of buffering is there that exists today between that parking lot and your property? Is there any current landscape buffering?
Yes. So there's some evergreen trees in there mixed with old growth buckthorn. Okay. So we're in the process on our property side of cutting out the buckthorn trees that are this big. There's some left still on the church side. The church side does have a lot of evergreens in there, so there is some buffer in there that exists.
Thank you.
Still, with the noise, lights, and proximity, we're hoping for that fence. Thanks. Any other questions for us or me?
No.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Any initial thoughts or questions?
No, we see the first concern is more hardcover, management of the stormwater. I honestly expected to see more residents from Schutz Lake here after a previous development we had on the north side, with the high concern from all the residents on that. I expected to see a little more discussion about that. Maybe that'll be longer down the line when we do have a public hearing on it. But that's always a concern, and stormwater management is a big deal, especially with the lake within the proximity that it is, and the complaints that have already been heard due to the inadequate by today's standards of Swiss Mountain's stormwater retention system. So with that being held, obviously that's going to be reviewed by the Minnehaha Watershed and the DNR. So, and their standards are at the ultimate height of their being right now. So just to keep that in regard, we are having a lot more hard cover. And then the question would be, are we approaching our maximum hard cover impervious surface coverage for this R3?
We're not yet, because their site is large as a whole. They'd be getting close. But to back up slightly and talk just specifically to the stormwater management, so they have put together a stormwater management plan. That's been submitted to us just for review, so we understand what they're trying to accommodate. But they're also going through the watershed district process, just like the Waterford Landing subdivision. So meeting the exact same rules. In fact, because they're doing enough of an improvement on the site, they actually need to have the whole portion that drains through that existing facility meet the current rules and not the previous rules that were in place when the first facility was built. So all of those things that have been discussed by kind of the residents around the lake still needing to be addressed as part of this project, just regardless kind of what the use would be. This being a church versus a residential subdivision still has to meet the same objectives for water leaving the site.
Sure. I think that's very important information to have at those public meetings. And as we know, with this group in this lake area being a steep slope area also on the backside, so that's very important on the front end. So thank you.
Related to that, I had my mind went in similar places, Todd. Just out of curiosity, Ben, generally how often do we dredge these existing ponds, and would that be part of the stormwater management plan, is to dredge and kind of get it back to a base state prior to the construction?
So this is kind of a unique position that doesn't happen often, but I'd say is fairly typical in the city for commercial or multifamily sites where these facilities are not owned or maintained by the city. They're actually owned and maintained by the site owner. I know that part of the evaluation process was identifying what capacity the stormwater pond today has, and through some of the work here, they would obviously need to make sure that they're accommodating what the end need is based upon the current rules. So whether it needs to be dredged or doesn't need to be dredged, they still have to accommodate for what storage capacity does the facility today have and what's the need with these additional improvements. So again, still needing to meet that ultimate goal.
So to put you on the spot a little bit, in general, what's the city-owned ponds, how often do we dredge those?
We have not dredged a pond yet. We're getting to that point where we have some that are being evaluated to figure out what all is involved. Most of the time it has to do with the buildup that happens in the pond to identify first, is there any material that we can't dispose of on our own? But even the state as a whole with some of the stormwater quality requirements, I think all cities are trying to ramp up and understanding what are these long-term maintenance or operational needs of these types of facilities. And truthfully, I don't think that we're fully understanding that yet, other than we're trying to figure that out.
Okay. And in general, maybe general practice, is it typically a site-by-site decision, or do cities in general tend to have a more blanket policy where every 10 years or 15 years or 20 years things are evaluated?
I think generally we inspect annually, so all the ponds get inspected, all the inlets and outlets, to make sure those devices are functioning properly. And we're actually, from a staff perspective, going through evaluating what's the order of magnitude in terms of a policy for why we would prioritize one pond over the other versus coming up with kind of a routine schedule, so to speak, because there may be some that, one, need to be managed more often or have a priority if they get to a state where they need to be reconditioned, because maybe they directly output to a lake where some others have a different kind of course or channel that they daylight from. So we're going through that process at a staff level at this point to try to come up with that policy and procedure.
Okay, thank you. Just being in proximity to Schutz Lake, it's the main source for collecting water. You know, there's a lot of sheeting that's going to occur off the impervious surface. It just kind of raises that as a concern, but I understand that the stormwater management plan will be looking to address that. So,
And Ben, staying on stormwater, as long as we're there, at the beginning, I was kind of reading some of this, and I might have missed what you had said. Is there going to be an infiltration basin system proposed for the parking lot?
They are adding that to the stormwater management facility on the west side of the site.
Oh, on the west side of the site, okay. So nothing in the parking lot, no impervious surface in the parking lot, it'll all be runoff type asphalt?
It all get piped into that stormwater facility, so it all heads to the
From
west.
a catch basin system?
Correct.
Though. Okay. There's large amounts of maintenance, and since I've been in the trade and installing those, they don't get maintenance until they fail. And that's what we're trying to avoid through a maintenance agreement, or especially if it's privately owned. Then for sure it won't get maintenance till it fails. That's just a fact. And then loading of them as, if they're parking lot bound, it can be a hazard to fire trucks and other heavy vehicles. So that's something else we got to keep in mind. And it doesn't always get caught in the building inspection review because it's more of a fire thing, and it's an ASHTO rating that comes from the highway department. So if we see something like that as a substitute, we got to keep our eyes open. But if it's all going to be on the west side of the building as a filtration basin, we're in the clear there. So.
Ben, I got a couple questions about so building materials and site plan review. I'm trying to, I guess, clarify in my own mind sort of how far of a reach, do we have? So the conditional use process was a little bit different before, because that was just the nature of that allowed for conditions to be attached to that approval. Is there an opportunity to include those types of things in this type of resolution? So, for example, when we're talking about the fence along the north property line, or buffer management along the north property line, I remember a good discussion around that back in 2014 when we had that.
Sure.
And I don't think that incompatible uses necessarily applies here in terms of adjacency of sites, but I think from a practical standpoint, there's some merit to that idea, and I think that's why it was broadly supported last time.
So, and had this brief dialogue via email with Mr. Levering, and one of the reasons why you don't see specific call-outs for that fence replacement as part of this approval is that we don't have that requirement within our city code. Certainly what you would have experienced, and Mr. Levering was referencing in 2014, the idea of getting a little bit more year-round screening through the addition of the fence, I think makes a lot of sense, other than we don't have it as a standing requirement. So the mechanism of going through a conditional use process where you're asking for an exception to something and then working with the city to come up with other things that, because you're impacting conditions around you, looking at things like the addition of an opaque fence replacing a chain link fence, I think certainly makes a lot of sense. Today, if you looked at the existing vegetation along that boundary line between the two properties on the north side of the site, it is fairly diverse tree types, where it is a lot of evergreens that provide kind of a year-round buffer between the two sites. And I think that's why it was appropriate when I responded that I did copy the church on it, to make sure that they were aware that, this dialogue had taken place. I think a commitment had been made, and even though the project didn't move forward, that doesn't necessarily change the circumstances of what had been gone through in 2014. I'm not confident here today saying that it's a great idea, other than capturing Mr. Lovering's request in the minutes, that there's a good way of trying to say, we'll grant you site plan and building material approval if you include that fence, because it's not a code requirement. They're not asking for an exception with this proposal, which literally is the only reason why you don't see it on there, is because I think from a legal standpoint, I don't know that's the best position for the city to put things in writing where we don't have the authority to do so.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm not suggesting that we step out of bounds, but I think that clarity is important because from a protocol standpoint, while we can all agree with it or believe it's a good idea, this is just a case of neighbors having a conversation among themselves, but if it's not required, it's not really something that we can attach as part of this process.
But I do think, as Mr. Lovering explained, the response from the church when asked if they would stand by their commitment was that they would uphold the commitment that they made in 2014. So again, I think because we record these, we're actually stream these meetings, we capture minutes, we'll make sure that it's reflected in the minutes that item was brought forward and that commitment had been identified to the property owners.
Ben, I have a question about that. Is that the same way that we went about when the handling I think it was a wall for the adjoining two properties out here for the new building, and I think the existing apartment owner over there had a concern about a wall on that adjoining property. Was it just a recommendation we made rather than...
Correct. So there was a condition for coordination because the construction of that wall, a little different with constructing a wall versus a fence,
Sure.
but that the coordination occurred between the two property owners related to the timing and how that construction would take place, is what you're recalling from
Sure.
the project across the street from City Hall.
Okay. Thanks for the clarity.
That's good. So I think, you sharing your concern and being on the record and, discussion reflecting general support for whatever that's worth, that, continue to have dialogue with your neighbor, I guess is the encouraging word.
What about in regards to what Mr. Levering brought up was, the difference in information, it seemed like, in regards to the city code for parking lots of more than 10 being within property lines. Is that what you were looking up right now?
Yep, so I was going through the section of the ordinance that was being referenced is, let's go to section 9, which is actually the old R district. So our municipal code, this site that hosts our code, has not been updated since we revised all the new zoning districts. But let's just walk through really quick what he was referring to. So one, the R district relates to Mr. Lovering's property, is in an R district. The zoning that exists for Mount Olivet Church is actually the MR district, the multiple residence district that's now the R3.
So in the new terms, Mr. Levering's property would be an R1, the church would be an R3.
Correct. Having said that, so the item that I believe is being referred to is under permitted uses, where it talks about number 3. It says churches, chapels, temples, synagogues, provided the site contains 3 acres. No building on the site is located closer than 50 feet. A parking lot isn't necessarily a building.
Actually, keep scrolling.
Okay.
Section 1029.4.
1029.
There you go. So it says parking lots, 3 parking lots.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sure. So this portion also would have been, again, because we're in the residential district, which isn't the zoning district that the church is located on, is not subject to that condition. That would be if the church was in an R1 district, and those provisions were modified with some of the zoning ordinance updates. So things like under the current ordinance that's available before you go into this site, So if you click on the amendment, this section 109, we deal with parking. Remember, we did the update to not only the zoning ordinances, but the landscaping and open space section. We talked about beautification and parking standards. So we do have a 15-foot separation requirement, but because we're dealing with two zoning districts, the buffer requirement would come into play. So there'd need to be a 25-foot buffer requirement between the two, and those planting requirements are satisfied with the existing vegetation between the two sites. So if I went up here and we were to look at just the grove of trees that's along that northern 25-foot section of the church's property, and granted some of those trees are on the adjoining property, but just the trees within the church's property, they would satisfy that buffer requirement between the two properties. And as you can see, and what I noted before, a lot of those tree types are more of an evergreen variety. So they are providing somewhat of a year-round screen. And I'm not trying to discredit just the thought that having an opaque fence enhances that treatment and the fact that the church is doing that. But if we didn't have this previous action related to an opaque fence, we'd still be requiring some kind of buffer between those two zoning districts if it wasn't necessarily this specific request.
So really, the discrepancy comes in old zoning versus our new zoning standards, which it sounds like this fits in with our new R3 zoning standards, and then two different zoning standards abutting each other.
Correct.
Basically.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Mm-hmm.
So where can I access the new zoning standards?
It's before you click on the Muni Code website. So when you're just here on this page that says City Code at the top, the amended section 109 is the third bullet, and we do kind of quarterly updates into that MuniCo site to clean up what's hosted on that location, but any updates are on the city's website before you go into that. So that section would be here where it says 415. That was the ordinance number that updated all the new zoning regulations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that, thank you for the clarity.
And I think you had one other question, Jeff, if I
Yeah, I did actually.
Materials and such. So in our general section, which I know we're in the process of getting towards adoption through city council, it's a discussion item here. So we do have, if I can get to it, sorry, you probably have this better. Zoning districts, performance standards. Okay, so residential structures. So because this is in a residential district, we're dealing with exterior building finishes that consist of materials comparable in grade and quality to the following: brick, natural stone, precast concrete units, wood, curtain wall panels of steel. There's a whole litany of things. But basically, the materials that are on the church today that are being proposed as part of this addition fall into those various categories that are required for residential structures. So when we're going through this process, we're just ensuring that what's called out as required materials is being upheld as part of the review.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I agree that the building materials is actually the more straightforward part of this review, and so I'm kind of dialed into the site plan. So trying to understand what aspects of the site plan that we want to really evaluate. One of them that comes to mind is site safety. And so, for example, I think there's a fair amount of grade change that happens, for example, from Rolling Acres Road to the parking lot, but it's a little unclear to me. We don't have necessarily detailed grades in site plan, but do you have some background on that?
Better if we want to speak to why we're changing some of the elevations, even of the existing parking lot, just from a functional standpoint.
I
Good evening. Dave Ray with Henderson Johnson Associates, the project civil engineer. I'd love to answer your questions. Do you have a more specific question on a particular part of it, or I may have missed it? I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. So I'm looking at this from a site safety standpoint, and so not only because I understand the diverse nature of the uses that happen on the site, whether it's not just church, there's education programs, there's kids on site, there's various other events that may happen on site, but I'm thinking about from a grade change standpoint. So it's not clear to me on the drawings what the change in grade. My sense is there's probably a retaining wall of some sort shown on the perimeter of parking.
Yeah, I think I understand your questions, but stop me if I'm not answering your question the way you want me to. The existing building, the residential structure that's on the northern end of the site, is kind of up on a hill.
Right.
And to make the parking lot work with grades so that everything is less than 5% or so, that hill is being knocked down. And in result, on the back side or the north side and the east side, there is a retaining wall that abuts that. So the high ground would be the existing ground on the top side of the wall, towards the north or towards the east. The parking lot is on the low side of the wall. So that's how that is being developed.
Yeah. And so from a site safety standpoint, I have to admit I didn't go and look at the requirements, but my sense is that after a certain change in grade, for example, is there a fence at the top of the retaining wall?
Yes, there is.
Okay, and so that's part of the proposal,
Yep.
At least at the perimeter of the parking lot. And then the other one that triggered my question was when I looked at some of the elevations. And Ben, I'm thinking on page 2 of our elevation and floor plan packet, there's, as we go towards the back at half of the site, there's pretty significant changes in grade again.
Yep.
And I see there's some, I guess I'll call it raised parapet or raised site walls that are helping with that, but I noticed on the top one, there isn't. And again, question from a site safety standpoint, or is that factored in whether or not there's fences required?
Well, we do have some retaining walls on the south side of the addition, and there's actually a set of stairs that goes from the middle level. So there's 3 levels. The main level is where the sanctuary is today. So for now, let's just call it the upper level. It's really the main level, but it's the upper level. There's a mid-level, and then there's a lower level where the loading dock functions are proposed. The middle level exits out to the south, and then there is a set of stairs, exterior stairs, that wraps around and goes to the west and transitions down to into that lower level area.
I have my cursor on it right now, if you're looking at the screen.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
Ben, can you go back to the elevation?
Yep.
And so if you zoom in on the white box, so to speak, yep. So, there's that low wall. I see the double doors, and to the left of that, that has a knee wall. That's good. And then up at the next tier is another knee wall. Yep. But now if you go up in there at that corner of the building, I'm just seeing there isn't the same treatment, and I'm not necessarily. Does that need a fence?
So
Yeah, we're providing fences on every retaining wall that is 30 inches or taller, and that's per code. So,
Okay.
yeah, to answer that particular part of the question. Can I go back to one other thing that maybe you were asking, but maybe not? You were asking about site safety. We did communicate with the county because off of the county road, if a car were to exit off the county road, there's a potential they can go over the retaining wall right into the parking lot, right? We did communicate and provide cross sections to the county highway department and their engineers, and they determined that the setback is fine enough. There's the safety zone for a car leaving the road is adequate. We don't have to take any additional or special provisions for that retaining wall. So I don't know if that was part of your question, but I just wanted to offer that as well.
Related, so that's good. My sense is, understanding how high that residential structure currently exists, these are going to be pretty tall retaining walls, right?
I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I might be able to read the plan if the grading plan were pulled up, but I don't. Off the top of my head, I can't remember.
It's probably like 10 to 15 feet.
It's more closer to 10 than it is to 15.
Okay.
I think it's like 7 to 10 might be the answer, but I can I don't have it memorized, I'm sorry.
So my question is probably more simple than in the way that I asked it, is just simply that, site safety and protecting kids on site and,
Sure.
Whether it's required or not, but it sounds like you've got that accommodated. You've got fences where it's required for steep falls, and that's a good thing, so.
Sure.
So the building code would extend to the path, the area, the yard connected to the building also, as far as your fall protection goes. You see what I'm saying?
Right, yeah, and so making the connection out onto the other site features.
Yep.
Parking lot perimeters and those types of things, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So on elevation, since we're kind of there with Jeff's great point though about the site safety and all that, that's something you don't always think of, but looking at A40.10, which is the west-facing elevation towards the lake,
Yes.
previously all we had was basically a gabled end roof facing that looked residential.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have a 3-story commercial building looking over our residential lake. There's quite a slope there as far as trees and natural
There's
buffering. I mean, how high does that reach? Has anyone from the neighborhood, I guess, I don't see it from my house and I don't see it when I drive by it.
Yep.
But has anyone from the lake made that comment yet? Are they worried about that exposure?
They haven't, and I'm sure most of it is because the other side of the lake is Three Rivers Park District. But there is also significant vegetation, as you can see here, that provides a pretty good screen off-site, so to speak. So other than off-leaf conditions, there's probably not a ton of visibility even from the lake when you're there into the site.
Because now looking at the picture you have up, the blue color building, the peak of the roof line, if we come down, maybe halfway point, it'll be building all the way across there to the south.
Right. Other than shorter, if you're seeing the peak of the roof, you won't have another peak with the addition proposed.
It looks like pretty heavy vegetation and people, all right. That's, because that was a concern they had with the development to the north.
Yes,
Originally
correct.
was a sight line.
I think there's much greater distance here from where the addition
Away
is from the edge of the lake as well, so that certainly helps.
Okay, I was just curious. Thank you.
Hey, Ben, while you had that map pulled up,
Yep.
all the way back up by Rolling Acres Road, the southernmost entrance into the property,
Yes.
does that entrance now become completely separate from the other two entrance, and that's the only entrance into those other buildings down
That's
on the
correct.
property?
Yes.
Through my other role with the city fire department, I was asked to take one of our city fire engines through that area to see what the access would be like to get into those buildings through that southernmost entrance only, not having the opportunity to go in now through the other entrances. Was any of that information relayed back to you through Chief Hager?
Correct. And we did have a meeting with the applicant and did talk through some site modifications that have been included with the site plan that's proposed to modify. It was removing a couple stalls on the very south side near
Correct,
the
yep.
entrance, a slight modification of the radius here, and then they had reworked from an initial proposal, reworked some of how this drive extends down to the backside of the new addition to accommodate the turning movements needed for the truck.
I think that was covered absolutely everything I conveyed to him. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
No, none for me.
Mine are covered.
Anybody prepared to make a motion?
All right, I'll make a motion recommending the approval of resolution number 17-13, which states a resolution recommending approval of a site plan and building materials for an addition to Mount Olivet Lutheran Church for their property located at 7200 Rolling Acres Road with the 4 conditions as listed.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Sounds like this will move forward next council meeting, I assume?
That's correct.
Thank you, and thank you for the feedback. All right, so we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a discussion item. Section 109 in general. I bet there's more detail to that, so I'll pass it to you, Aaron.
There's a bit, but we're going to try to keep it a bit brief based on our robust conversation we had at our last meeting on Tuesday. So based on the discussion, there were quite a few edits to the city code just in our discussion that I wanted to capture and get it before you one more time just to make sure that everyone felt comfortable with what it looked like moving forward. So again, just a discussion. We tried to capture as many of the changes that we discussed. I would also like to thank Cindy, our city clerk, because she helped me quite a bit through some of the trickier parts. So if you just reviewed it one last time and give a head nod that everything looks good, that we're capturing things correctly, that's my main goal, just to make sure everybody's comfortable with some of the changes that were made.
After you looked to incorporate all the comments, you didn't have any additional questions or seeking any clarity on any particular items from us?
So, not from the commission specifically. I worked with Ann, our Parks and Rec director, as well as our Public Works director on that pool discussion that we had for quite a long time as to where we should drain pools. And she came up with a really valid point that before you drain a pool, you likely shouldn't be putting chemicals into it 2 days before you drain it at grade, just because it will really quickly kill your grass. So I did a little bit of research as to what other cities use, and there were a couple cities that said stop using chemicals 7 days before you begin to drain your pool, just so then if it does enter any system that it shouldn't, it's not heavily chlorinated and will likely not affect a system as much as it would if there was a high chemical use the day before.
Yeah, I also did the same thing, and I went on even our own city where I work, the website and everything. I saw everything from dump it down the curb, hook it to the sanitary, dispose of it any way you want. I mean, I think it's such a small issue and such a low percentage of the residences that have pools. And the amount of water isn't that great because
Right.
you don't fully drain them, that I just don't think it's an issue. A heavy issue anyway, so.
For those that maybe weren't a part of the last discussion, did anything stand out as unusual?
It did not.
A lot of stuff we've talked about in length the last few meetings.
Can you scroll the definitions up to, we had cluster development in there, did we?
Here.
Yep. We had changed that language so that looks simpler. It was a lot longer before. And then what else do we have? Did we have a definition for a dwelling unit?
Like a principal dwelling was added.
Yeah, we had a principal dwelling. How about dwelling unit? Did we read?
There's dwelling here, and then it breaks down the types. And then dwelling unit is here as well.
Yep, I think we had, that was about 3 meetings ago.
And I think,
I just found my old notes I was looking for before, so.
and principal structure was a new one that you added,
Correct.
right?
We also cleaned up the administrative official too, which we had a pretty lengthy discussion about last week.
That's right.
Yep. And then the last one I had noted was townhome. We had talked about that 2 or 3 times.
Oh, sorry, it's under dwelling, comma, townhome.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. Sorry to make you maybe dizzy with my scrolling. There, so it's here.
Yeah, so the language attached horizontally, we had talked about that and haven't exposed for the,
That essentially means side by side rather
Yeah.
than stacked. Right?
Exactly. We had talked about saying attached by a common vertical wall.
I remember that.
That more depicts how it's going to be, and that's really what a townhome is.
They'd even
With
bring
a private
this-
entrance, and also that it has, each unit has its separate building services.
Sure. Like independent dwelling unit.
Does the building code require that a townhome unit have individual services?
Yeah, if they're listed with a separate PID and address, they have to have their own service.
Sure.
I'd even bring this up, since you worked really hard on it, the other thing I might look at is has exposed front and rear wall to be used as access for lighter ventilation. What if the townhome development has 4 units and it's a quad?
Right.
And don't feel bad about bringing that up. That's why it's here.
Well, you guys work so hard on it. We've talked this a lot in my short tenure.
It's important though.
Yeah, I think I could just say 2 wall exposure.
Or is it front and or rear?
I think it's front and or rear, because you'll see some units that are 6 units in a building, and the middle unit on either side backs up. It basically has 3 common walls.
So
If
I
you really
think,
want to get technical in the product inventory that's currently out there today.
and I apologize because I didn't go back and listen to the previous meeting, but it sounds like you had quite a bit of discussion. I think the goal of having different definitions for row home versus townhome was to have that distinction. So a townhome could be attached only on the side or front to back, the row home just being that linear progression. So if we can, maybe have the recommendation include just that differentiation. So the row home becomes where it's more similar, I would say, to the end of what we currently show in that.
So a row home, once again, we're getting into a marketing thing as opposed to a
Right.
building code thing.
Yep.
So I think the intent would be to stay towards the building code more than a marketing type deal. But, I mean, you can have multiple types of townhomes, for sure.
And the only reason I think it's worthwhile having the distinction is we do speak to those terms in the zoning districts. And I think it's important to have the distinction of when you have just one row that's not allowed to have back-to-back units versus when you may be able to have back-to-back units. I think long-term we'd want to have that distinction in terms of what the end product might be. I mean, it could be ambiguous. We could certainly remove row home. It just makes the definition of a townhome need to be a little bit lengthier to describe how the end product might be viewed. So I think I was trying to simplify it in terms of how we describe it from a zoning perspective.
And right now, I mean, there was just a change to actually what a townhome is now as far as building code and rules that go with it. It's any structure, 3 units or more individually owned in any form or fashion.
Correct.
So they try to make it as basic too, but it was more from a safety standpoint with the fire stuff they changed. And
Yep.
so if you find in your process that row home's gonna be easier for you as a staff, that's more important than what my opinion is.
I think the goal with a lot of the updates that we're trying to make, and I'm only saying this, you know this, but it just, because we're talking about why we're changing, is so that when someone proposes, developer comes in and has a proposal that we can clearly identify, are they proposing a townhome? Well, it might be a front to back situation. If they're proposing row homes, we're talking about just a single linear building that has multiple units in it.
Sure. A row of townhomes.
Yes.
Ben, I just have to say,
You gotta let it go. It's
I make things difficult. don't I?
well, no, I was going to back up and say, knowing the quality of summer television, I can't believe that you didn't listen to our
I know.
to our
I
meeting.
apologize. When I went on, because it's tough. Normally it was challenging to step away, but I did.
not even with
A lot of confidence in.
Good thing you surround yourself with good people like Aaron
That's right.
to cover for you like that.
That's right. Come on.
It looks good.
Thank
Nice
you.
job.
Yeah, I didn't have any further comments. Appreciate the diligence. Are you seeking action?
No, this was just
Feedback.
based on the amount of feedback that there was from the last meeting. I just wanted you to get one more look after some of the changes were made.
Right, because our approval at the last meeting was contingent upon the update, or
Correct.
make the updates, but that, you could have gone straight to council with it, but instead you're just circling back.
Right. And it's a
Appreciate
bit
that.
odd because we had 2 planning commission meetings in a row. We haven't had a council meeting since our last planning commission meeting, so the timing worked really nicely to get some of this done.
That sounds good. Should we move on then? Anything else? No?
No, that was great. Thank you.
All right, next item on the agenda then is council meeting updates. And based on what you just said, since there has been no council meeting,
There has not, no.
we can skip that. Next is miscellaneous. Anybody?
The only thing that I was going to bring up for the benefit of the group that Aaron brought to my attention before we started is that our next meeting, which would be August 1st, is also the same night as National Night Out. There aren't any current development proposals that I'm aware of that would align with that night. The only thing that I'd like to do in the next couple of weeks, because we have about 3 before we get to that August 1st meeting, is just make sure that we don't end up with a proposal that needs to wait longer than what we can allow them to wait. So I'll definitely follow up in the next probably week and a half. But I would say today, I know a lot of past commissioners have participated in National Night Out, and certainly if we don't need to meet because of development, we can continue our ordinance evaluation and those things at a future meeting date. But barring any changes that may pop up, I would suspect that we would cancel that. And I would only suspect that if something were to come in that needed some kind of turnaround, I might be in contact to try to move that date to maybe the following week if that was absolutely necessary. I don't see that happening, but at least wanted to bring it up tonight.
Sure, I'm available that following week if you choose to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Separate topic. Everyone's good with that.
Sure.
We do have another comprehensive plan steering committee meeting tomorrow night, getting into more of a wrap-up report and review of existing conditions and starting kind of a review. If you haven't been aware so far through some of the dialogue we've had at these meetings, I know everyone had seen the social pinpoint exchange, that site that we had launched, got really good feedback from there. We had also put together a survey. If you haven't taken that survey, I'd like to encourage you to do that. It's not very lengthy. I think we've had 117 responses through noon today. Pretty good feedback. I think a lot of things that are telling us things that we've heard on a fairly regular basis in probably the last year, but still a good gut check on especially some of the housing things. Nice to still see that the community still values trying to get some kind of entry-level housing, single-family focus, kind of that diversity topic that we've talked about, senior living options. But again, don't feel like because you're on this committee that you shouldn't, for some reason, participate. I definitely recommend everyone, maybe because you're in this role, it'd be nice to get in and take that survey. It'd probably take you maybe 10 minutes at most. Go through that. We'll also start brainstorming with them tomorrow about, based upon the types of feedback we've received, what might need to change or what should we be thinking about as our consultant starts to develop some revised concepts for some of those growth areas that are being evaluated south of current city limits and west. Our goal ultimately is to use August, so our goal being staff and the consultant to start developing some of those concepts to the point where we might roll them out on Social Pinpoint, get initial reaction from those based upon feedback that's been received and what we talk about with the committee. Also be looking in August to probably do a more formal update with all the information that's been reviewed with the whole planning commission, so more of a discussion item with you all to make sure that for the 5 of you that aren't on the committee, that you understand kind of what we've been going through kind of on a more holistic level, and kind of get some additional reaction from what the committee has provided for feedback. Otherwise, I know that we still continue to get inquiries on new development proposals, some of the preliminary plats, so the Vanderlinde piece that was proposed as Hill Point, as well as
Meadows.
the Hess property that's proposed at the Meadows at Wasserman Lake. Those are still moving forward into construction drawing and final plat proposals, so they're just starting to come in. Would anticipate that we would see them both probably in late August or early September. And then we've got a few other potential projects for commercial improvements downtown that might come in the coming months as well. So good things to look forward to.
Steph?
Thanks, Ben. Anybody else have anything under miscellaneous? Hearing none, I move that we adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Somebody's gonna want to go home, right?
Where's the survey?